He poured boiling water on his 7 months pregnant wife. Not by accident. Not in a moment of rage he couldn't control. He did it deliberately, coldly, methodically, all to prove his loyalty to his mistress, who whispered that the baby was blocking his future. He burned her skin, scarred her body, tried to erase her from his life while she carried his child. He thought that would be the end of her, that she would disappear into her pain and shame, maybe lose the baby, maybe just fade away like he wanted. But what Naomi did next didn't just shock her husband and his mistress. It dismantled their entire world, exposed years of hidden abuse and fraud, stripped them of everything they'd built on lies, and left them facing criminal charges they never saw coming. And the most shocking part? She did it all from a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, while everyone thought she was too broken to fight back. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from: Lagos, Accra, London, maybe New York or Toronto. We want to know. 3 years ago, Naomi Reeves was someone who mattered. At 26, she sat in air-conditioned offices in Lagos, reviewing procurement documents for an international NGO, her sharp eyes catching discrepancies that others missed. She documented fraud with the precision of a surgeon, traced corruption through supply chains that stretched across West Africa, and built cases that held powerful people accountable. Her colleagues respected her. Her supervisors promoted her. She was building something real, something that would last, a career with purpose and a future she controlled. Then she met Ethan Carter at a church conference in Abeokuta, and everything changed. He walked into that fellowship hall like he owned it, tall and confident, his voice filling the room when he spoke about faith and business and building godly families. He quoted scripture with the ease of someone who'd grown up in the church, talked about logistics and supply chains in ways that made Naomi lean forward with interest, and when he smiled at her across the room during the worship session, something inside her shifted. After the conference ended, he found her by the refreshment table and said, "You're Naomi Reeves, the auditor. I've heard about your work. You're exactly the kind of woman this country needs more of." She fell in love with those words before she fell in love with him. Their courtship was everything Naomi had hoped for, but never expected to find. Ethan drove from Abeokuta to Lagos every weekend to see her, brought her mother flowers, sat through Sunday dinners answering Mrs. Reeves' probing questions with patient grace. He talked about partnership, about supporting her career, about raising children who would be taught to value integrity and excellence. He made Naomi feel seen in ways she'd never experienced, like her ambitions weren't threats but treasures, like her strength was something to celebrate rather than diminish. When he proposed after 8 months, kneeling in her tiny Lagos apartment with a modest ring and tears in his eyes, Naomi said yes, without a single doubt. But her mother pulled her aside at the engagement party, gripping her arms with urgent fingers and searching her face with worried eyes. "Something about that man's eyes doesn't match his smile," Mrs. Reeves whispered. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll keep your own money separate, keep your own accounts, keep some part of yourself that belongs only to you." Naomi pulled away, frustration rising in her chest because her mother didn't understand. Ethan was nothing like the controlling men of her mother's generation, nothing like the husbands who isolated their wives and demanded submission disguised as headship. He was modern, progressive, and supportive. He wanted a partner, not a possession. They married in a beautiful ceremony at a church in Abeokuta. 200 guests witnessed their vows, and for the first 6 months, life was exactly what Naomi had dreamed. Then Ethan suggested she quit her job. The commute from Abeokuta to Lagos was too far for a wife, he said gently. They were trying for a baby, and she'd need to focus on preparing their home, on building the foundation for the family they'd create together. It made sense. She resigned, moved fully into his world, and became Mrs. Naomi Carter. That's when the man she married began to disappear, replaced by someone who criticized the way she cooked jollof rice, questioned why she needed money for groceries when he'd just given her money last week, made jokes at church gatherings about his wife's village woman, domestic skills that made everyone laugh while Naomi's face burned with humiliation. When she got pregnant, she thought becoming a mother would restore the tenderness between them. Instead, Ethan became colder, more distant, staying out late for business meetings, mentioning a woman named Lydia with increasing frequency. And Naomi, isolated from her career, her colleagues, her former life in Lagos, started to shrink. The confident auditor, who'd built cases against corrupt officials, became the anxious wife, constantly trying to anticipate her husband's moods, constantly failing to meet expectations she didn't understand, constantly wondering what happened to the woman she used to be. Lydia Moore didn't look like someone who destroyed marriages. She looked like success personified, tall, elegant, always dressed in clothes that whispered money rather than shouted it. She lived in a sleek apartment in Victoria Island, ran a boutique import business that catered to Lagos's elite, and moved through the world with the confidence of a woman who'd never been told no. When she met Ethan Carter at a business networking event in Lagos 2 years into his marriage, she saw exactly what she wanted. An ambitious man with potential, trapped in what she considered a mediocre domestic situation. Their affair started the way these things often do. With long conversations after official meetings ended, with text messages that began professionally and gradually became personal, with dinners that stretched into evenings. Ethan complained about his wife constantly. Naomi didn't understand business, he said. She'd let herself go after leaving Lagos. She was provincial, boring, content with small-town life in Abeokuta, while he had visions of expansion, of building something that mattered. Lydia listened, sympathized, and positioned herself as everything Naomi wasn't: sophisticated, ambitious, child-free, and endlessly available. Lydia never felt guilty. In her worldview, she wasn't the villain. Naomi was the obstacle, the woman who'd trapped a good man with pregnancy and domestic expectations before he could realize his full potential. If anything, Lydia told herself, she was saving Ethan from a life of mediocrity. But as Naomi's pregnancy progressed into the second trimester and then the third, Lydia's patience began to fray. She wanted more than stolen afternoons and secret hotel rooms. She wanted Ethan to leave his wife, to build a real life with her, to stop pretending his marriage mattered. Every time she raised the subject, though, Ethan hesitated. Divorce was expensive, he said. Socially complicated. His church community would judge him. His family would be disappointed. He needed time to figure out the right approach. What Lydia didn't fully understand was that Ethan liked his current arrangement perfectly. He had the respectable married image for church and business dealings, the devoted husband everyone admired. And he had Lydia for excitement, for the validation of being desired, for everything his marriage no longer provided. Why would he give up either advantage? Then Lydia made her move. During dinner at her apartment one evening, she looked across the table at Ethan and said quietly, "That baby is blocking your future. Our future. If you really love me, prove it. Show me she means nothing." It was manipulation at its cruelest, crowning violence as proof of devotion, making destruction seem like loyalty. And Ethan, trapped between two women and his own cowardice, began to believe the twisted logic. If Naomi was just gone somehow, all his problems would disappear.
No divorce expenses. No custody battles.
No awkward explanations to his church community. Just freedom. Meanwhile, Naomi was noticing things she'd tried to ignore before. Ethan's late nights had become routine. There was perfume on his shirts that smelled nothing like the modest fragrance she wore. When she checked their bank statements, something she rarely did anymore, she found expensive purchases. Jewelry she'd never received, restaurant bills from places they'd never visited together, hotel charges in Lagos when he claimed to be sleeping at budget guest houses. One evening, gathering courage she didn't know she still possessed, Naomi confronted him. "Who's Lydia?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan laughed, actually laughed, as if the question itself was ridiculous. "My business partner."
Why?
"Are you being paranoid again?" "I saw the text messages. The ones you didn't delete." His expression shifted then, from amusement to something colder. "You went through my phone?" That's a violation of trust, Naomi. Is it true? Are you having an affair? You're being hormonal. Pregnancy is making you imagine things. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that Naomi almost believed him. Almost convinced herself she was overreacting, seeing threats where none existed. But she'd seen those messages. She knew what she'd read. The psychological abuse escalated after that confrontation. Ethan withheld money for groceries, forcing Naomi to beg for basic necessities. He criticized her pregnant body with cruel precision, how much weight she'd gained, how unattractive she looked, how no wonder he sought companionship elsewhere. He stayed out all night without explanation, returning in the morning smelling like someone else's perfume and offering no apologies. When Naomi mentioned going to stay with her parents until the baby came, just for support during the final weeks, Ethan's mask slipped completely. He cornered her in their bedroom, his voice low and dangerous. "You have nothing. No job, no money, no options. You'll stay here and be grateful for what I provide. Because if you leave, if you try to take my child away from me, I'll make sure you never see a single naira. I'll destroy you." That's when Naomi realized the full extent of her situation. She was 7 months pregnant, financially dependent, isolated from her family and former colleagues, married to a man who might actually be dangerous. The confident auditor who once documented corruption and held powerful people accountable had become a trapped woman with nowhere to turn. And somewhere in Lagos, Lydia was planning their future together, convinced that Naomi would soon be out of the picture one way or another. The argument started over 15,000 Nigerian nairas. Such a small amount, really? Barely enough for basic baby supplies. Diapers, onesies, receiving blankets, the essentials Naomi needed before their daughter arrived. But when she asked Ethan for the money that evening, he looked at her like she'd requested a fortune. "More money? I just gave you money last week." "That was for food, Ethan. This is for the baby. She'll be here in 2 months. You're wasteful, irresponsible, always asking for money like I'm made of it." Something inside Naomi snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the months of accumulated abuse finally reaching a breaking point. Maybe it was just the desperation of a woman who'd been pushed too far for too long. "Your mistress's boutique isn't cheap, is it?" The words came out quietly, but they landed like a bomb. Ethan's head snapped up from his phone. His eyes went dark. "What did you just say to me? I know about Lydia. I know you've been spending our money on her while I'm 7 months pregnant with your child." The slap came so fast Naomi didn't register it until her cheek was burning and her ear was ringing. She stumbled backward, her hand instinctively going to her belly, protective and terrified. But Ethan wasn't done. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, rage flooding through him. Rage at being caught, at losing control, at Lydia's constant pressure, at this woman who wouldn't just disappear like he wanted her to. His eyes fell on the kettle sitting on the stove. Naomi had made herself tea an hour earlier, and the water was still hot, steam rising gently from the spout. "You want to talk about Lydia?" Ethan's voice had gone terrifyingly calm, flat and cold in a way that made Naomi's blood freeze. "Let me show you what you mean to me." He crossed the stove in 3 steps and grabbed the kettle. Naomi saw it happening in slow motion, her brain screaming at her body to move, to run, to do something. She tried to back away, trying to shield her pregnant belly with her arms. But Ethan poured the boiling water over her deliberately. Her back, her arm, her shoulder. The scalding liquid soaked through her thin cotton dress and onto her skin, and the pain was unlike anything Naomi had ever experienced. White-hot, searing, unbearable. The scream that tore from her throat was primal, animalistic, the sound of a woman being destroyed. She collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing, her hands clawing at her burning skin. Somewhere through the haze of agony, she heard neighbors shouting, heard someone pounding on the door, and heard the wood splinter as they forced their way in. By the time they burst into the kitchen, Naomi was on the floor in a pool of water and tears, her skin already blistering into angry red welts. And Ethan was standing over her, still holding the empty kettle, looking almost surprised by what he'd done, like he'd been somewhere else entirely and had just woken up to find himself in the middle of a nightmare. At the hospital, Ethan transformed completely. The rage vanished, replaced by the mask Naomi knew so well, the concerned husband, the devastated man whose wife had suffered a terrible accident. He cried publicly in the waiting room, his voice breaking as he told doctors and nurses what had happened. She was making tea. I was in the other room. I heard her scream and came running. She must have stumbled, knocked the kettle over on herself. Is she going to be okay? Is the baby okay? He played the role so convincingly that some of the hospital staff actually comforted him, patting his shoulder, assuring him that accidents happen, that his wife was in good hands. One nurse even brought him coffee and told him he was a good man for being so supportive. But Naomi, lying in that hospital bed wrapped in bandages, feeling every breath like knives against her burned skin, feeling her baby kick despite everything, despite the pain, despite the trauma, despite her mother's body being attacked, knew three things with absolute, crystalline clarity. First, Ethan had tried to hurt her badly enough that she might lose the baby. The scalding water on her belly had been deliberate, calculated. This wasn't rage. This was an attempted murder. Second, this was Lydia's influence. This was the proof of loyalty she demanded. Show me she means nothing. And Ethan had shown her. Third, if Naomi stayed silent, if she accepted Ethan's accident story, if she went back to that house and that marriage, neither she nor her child would survive. This was just the beginning. The violence would escalate. It always did. So when the nurse came to check her vitals that night, Naomi asked for a phone. Her voice was hoarse from screaming, her hands shaking as she held the device. But she didn't call Ethan's family, who would tell her to forgive, to pray, to keep the family together. She didn't call her own parents, who would say they'd warned her, who would be right but not helpful. She called Dr. Helen Okafor. Because Naomi remembered something from her auditor days, something a colleague had once told her about domestic violence cases. Documentation was everything. Patterns were everything. And medical professionals could see things that everyone else missed. Dr. Helen answered on the third ring, and when Naomi whispered, "I need help," the doctor said exactly what Naomi needed to hear. "Tell me everything. And this time, we're going to make sure the truth doesn't disappear."
Dr.
Helen Okafor arrived at the hospital within 40 minutes of Naomi's call, even though it was past 11 at night and she lived in another part of Abeokuta. She'd been an obstetrician for 22 years, long enough to recognize the patterns that others missed, long enough to know that accidents involving pregnant women often told stories their husbands didn't want heard. When Helen examined Naomi's burns in the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital room, she saw immediately what the emergency staff had been too busy or too naive to notice. The burn pattern was wrong. Completely wrong for an accidental spill. Boiling water knocked over in a fall would splash upward and outward, creating irregular patterns on the front of the body. But Naomi's burns ran in deliberate lines down her back, her shoulder, her arm. The trajectory of water being poured from above onto someone trying to shield themselves. "Naomi," Helen said quietly, pulling a chair close to the bed after checking that Ethan was still in the waiting room. "I need you to tell me the truth. Did your husband do this to you deliberately?" Naomi's eyes filled with tears. Years of conditioning screamed at her to protect him, to protect the marriage, to not shame the family. Good wives didn't accuse their husbands. Good wives kept family business private. Good wives suffered in silence and prayed for change. But as she felt her daughter kick inside her, as she remembered Ethan's cold voice saying, "Let me show you what you mean to me," Naomi found a strength she didn't know she still possessed. "Yes," she whispered. "He poured it on me. On purpose. Because I confronted him about his mistress. Because the baby is in the way." Helen's jaw tightened, but her voice remained gentle. "I'm filing a mandatory report. This is attempted murder, Naomi. You and your baby could have died. The burns on your abdomen could have caused premature labor, placental abruption, fetal distress. Do you understand how close you came?" Naomi nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "I'm also calling the police. Not hospital security, the actual police. And I'm going to document everything properly. The burn patterns, the defensive wounds on your arms, everything that proves this wasn't an accident." Within 2 hours, Inspector James Holloway arrived at the hospital. He was a methodical man in his late 40s, recently transferred from Lagos where he worked organized crime cases. He'd learned that the most dangerous criminals were often the most charming, the ones everyone trusted, the ones who wore respectable masks while committing unspeakable acts behind closed doors. He interviewed Ethan first, giving him every opportunity to maintain his story. Ethan performed beautifully, the concerned husband, the confused man who couldn't understand why the police were involved in what was clearly a tragic accident. His voice broke in all the right places. His hands trembled just enough to seem genuine. But James noticed things. The way Ethan's story had too many details, the kind people added when they were lying. The way he kept checking his phone, even during questions about his wife's condition. The way he showed no curiosity about Naomi's actual injuries, never asking to see her, never requesting to stay by her bedside. James also noticed the kettle, which he'd asked the neighbors to preserve. It had been on the back burner of the stove, the kind you had to reach for deliberately. The kitchen floor showed no evidence of water spillage consistent with a fall. And most tellingly, Naomi's burns were on her back and arms, areas impossible to injure in a forward fall toward a stove. Then James pulled Ethan's phone records. Lydia Moore's number appeared 47 times in the 3 days before the incident. 17 calls on the day of the attack alone, including 3 in the hour before Naomi was burned. "Mr. Carter," James said, his voice deceptively casual, "can you explain why you were in contact with Ms. Lydia Moore so frequently leading up to your wife's injury?" For the first time, Ethan's composure cracked. His eyes darted to the side. His hand went to his collar. "That's business. I don't see what that has to do with anything. Maybe nothing. Or maybe everything. We'll see." James didn't push further. Not yet. But he filed the case as aggravated assault pending investigation, and he obtained a protective order preventing Ethan from removing Naomi from the hospital or being alone with her without police presence. When Ethan was forced to sleep in a police-monitored waiting room that night instead of going home, instead of disappearing back into his normal life, he finally understood that something had shifted, that Naomi had done something unexpected. And Naomi, lying in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling while her burns throbbed and her baby moved inside her, did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She remembered who she used to be. Not Naomi Carter, the submissive wife who'd lost herself trying to save a marriage that was never real. But Naomi Reeves, the procurement auditor who'd built cases against corrupt officials, who knew how to trace money through complex systems, who understood that evidence and documentation could bring down people who thought they were untouchable. She'd spent 3 years thinking her old skills were irrelevant to her new life as a wife and soon-to-be mother. But now, lying in that hospital bed wrapped in bandages, Naomi realized something profound. Those skills weren't gone. They'd just been waiting for the moment she'd need them most. And that moment had arrived. 3 days after the attack, while Naomi was still hospitalized under observation for premature labor risks, Lydia Moore made the catastrophic mistake that would ultimately destroy her. She walked into that hospital ward in designer heels and a tailored pantsuit, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She told the nurse at the station that she was Ethan's business partner checking on the family, and because no one thought to question a well-dressed woman with confidence in her voice, she was directed straight to Naomi's room. Naomi was alone. Dr. Helen was in surgery. The nurse had just stepped out to check on another patient. The timing was perfect, which later made Naomi wonder if Lydia had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. Lydia stood at the foot of the hospital bed, looking down at Naomi's bandaged arms with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy. It was something closer to satisfaction, like an artist admiring her work. "You look terrible," Lydia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper so no one in the corridor could hear. "Burned, pregnant, pathetic. Do you really think anyone's going to believe you over Ethan? Over us?" Naomi said nothing. She just watched Lydia with exhausted eyes, her hand resting protectively on her belly. He's mine, you understand? Lydia continued, stepping closer to the bed.
He's always been mine.
You were just convenient. The respectable wife for church and business appearances. But that baby you're carrying? That's blocking everything we've built. Everything we could be. Still, Naomi remained silent, which seemed to embolden Lydia further. You should take the hint. Lydia leaned in, close enough that Naomi could smell her perfume, the same scent that had clung to Ethan's clothes for months. Accidents happen all the time. Women lose babies. Women die in childbirth, especially in Nigeria where medical care isn't always reliable. If you were smart, you'd sign whatever divorce papers Ethan gives you, take whatever small settlement he offers, and disappear back to your village where you belong. Lydia's voice dropped even lower, almost intimate. Because if you fight this, if you try to take him down, no one will believe a burned, pregnant housewife over a successful businessman and his educated business partner. You have no job, no money, no credibility. You're nothing, Naomi. You've always been nothing. She straightened up, smoothing her suit jacket. So be smart. Disappear quietly. Let Ethan and me build the life we deserve. And maybe, if you're cooperative, he'll be generous with child support. Maybe. Lydia smiled then, cold, triumphant, certain of her victory. Think about it. Think about what's best for that baby. Because if you make this difficult, if you try to fight us, you'll lose everything. And your child will suffer for your pride. She turned and walked out, her heels clicking confidently down the hospital corridor, leaving Naomi lying in that bed, shaking with a combination of fear and rage. What Lydia didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Dr. Helen, concerned for Naomi's safety after the initial incident, had installed a small security camera in the room. The kind normally used to monitor high-risk patients, positioned discreetly on a shelf to capture the entire space. Hospital policy in cases where domestic violence was suspected. Every word of Lydia's threat had been recorded. Every gesture. Every cold smile. The entire confession is captured in clear digital video with perfect audio. When Dr. Helen returned from surgery that evening and checked the security footage as part of her routine monitoring, she watched the entire exchange twice, her expression growing darker with each viewing. Then she immediately called Inspector James Holloway. I have evidence, she said without preamble. The mistress just confessed to conspiracy. She threatened my patient. She implied knowledge of the attack. And she made direct threats about the baby's safety. James arrived within the hour. He watched the footage on Helen's laptop, taking notes, his face impassive but his pen moving rapidly across the page. This is premeditation, he said quietly. This proves Lydia more knew about the attack, possibly encouraged it, and is now actively threatening the victim and her unborn child. Combined with the phone records showing all those calls before the incident, we have a conspiracy. He looked at Naomi, who'd been brought in to watch the footage herself. Mrs. Carter, are you willing to press charges? Not just against your husband, but against her as well. Naomi stared at the frozen image on the screen, Lydia's face, that cold smile, that absolute certainty that she'd won. And Naomi thought about her daughter, about the life she was fighting for, about the woman she used to be, who never backed down from exposing corruption and abuse. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite everything. I want charges filed against both of them. I want the truth documented. I want justice. James nodded. Then, that's what we'll pursue. But I need to warn you, this is going to get worse before it gets better. When they realize you're fighting back, when they understand you have evidence, they're going to try to discredit you. They'll say you're unstable, hormonal, and vindictive. They'll try to paint you as the problem. Let them try, Naomi said quietly. I have something they don't have. What's that? The truth. And the skills to prove it. That night, after James left and the hospital fell into its evening quietly, Naomi lay in her bed and felt something shift inside her. Not the baby, though her daughter kicked regularly, strong and healthy despite everything. This was something deeper. A fundamental change in how she saw herself and her situation. She'd spent 3 years shrinking, diminishing, trying to become small enough that Ethan wouldn't hurt her. Trying to be perfect enough that he'd love her again, if he ever had. But Lydia's visit had clarified something crucial. There was no version of Naomi that would ever be enough, because this wasn't about her inadequacy. It was about their cruelty, their greed, their willingness to destroy another human being to get what they wanted. And if they were willing to destroy her, then she had nothing left to lose by fighting back. Naomi reached for her phone and opened a new note. She began typing, her fingers moving faster as the plan took shape in her mind. She would need her laptop. She would need access to financial records. She would need to contact old colleagues, people who understood the fraud investigation and evidence gathering. She would need to become Naomi Reeves again. The auditor who built ironclad cases, who never missed a detail, who knew how to follow money trails and document systematic abuse. But she would do it carefully, quietly. While everyone thought she was broken and helpless, she would be building a case that would strip Ethan and Lydia of everything they'd taken from her. She would play the submissive wife. She would smile and apologize and seem defeated. And then, when the moment was right, she would show them exactly what happens when you underestimate a woman who knows how to fight back. While everyone saw a broken woman recovering in a hospital bed, Naomi's mind was working with the precision she developed during her years as an auditor. The skills she thought she'd left behind in Lagos, the methodical document analysis, the pattern recognition, the ability to trace financial corruption through layers of deception, were flooding back with startling clarity. She asked Dr. Helen brought her laptop, claiming she wanted to distract herself with reading while staying connected to the outside world. Helen understood immediately what Naomi was really asking for and arrived the next morning with a computer, a charger, and a knowing look. "Whatever you're planning," Helen said quietly, "be careful. And if you need anything, documents, witnesses, medical records, you tell me." Naomi nodded, already opening the laptop before Helen had even left the room. The first thing she did was rebuild her professional identity. She logged into dormant email accounts under her maiden name, Naomi Reeves. She contacted former colleagues at the NGO, carefully crafting messages that didn't reveal too much, but reconnected old professional relationships. She requested copies of her training materials on fraud detection and evidence documentation, claiming she was considering returning to work after her maternity leave. Then she started investigating her own husband. Using nothing but her phone and laptop, Naomi began pulling threads that would unravel Ethan's entire life. She accessed their joint bank account. She was still an authorized user, something Ethan had forgotten about in his arrogance. She downloaded 3 years of statements and began the painstaking work of tracing every transaction. The patterns emerged quickly once she knew what to look for. Large withdrawals always followed clusters of calls to Lydia's number. Cash transfers that Ethan had claimed were for business supplies corresponded exactly with dates Lydia had posted photos on social media showing new inventory at her boutique. Expensive jewelry purchases that Naomi had never received, paid for with money that should have been family funds. But the real discovery came when Naomi remembered the land. Her grandmother had left her 2 plots in Abeokuta when she died, modest parcels, but valuable given the city's growth. Naomi had never paid much attention to them and had trusted Ethan to manage the property while she focused on being a wife. Now, she requested official records from the land registry, claiming she needed documentation for estate planning before the baby arrived. What came back made her hands shake with rage. The land had been sold 6 months ago for 8.5 million Nigerian nairas, and the signature on the sales documents was supposedly hers, except Naomi had never signed anything. She'd never even been told about the sale. Ethan had forged her signature. He'd stolen her inheritance and sold it without her knowledge or consent. She traced where the money went, not into their joint account, not into any family investment. The entire amount had been transferred directly into the account of Lydia's import business, listed as a capital investment in the business registration documents. Naomi sat back against her hospital pillows, the laptop balanced on her knees, and felt a cold clarity settle over her. This wasn't just infidelity. This wasn't just domestic abuse. This was systematic financial fraud, forgery, and theft. These were crimes that carried serious penalties under Nigerian law. But she didn't call Ethan and scream. She didn't confront him or threaten him. She just documented everything. Screenshots, official records, certified bank statements. She built a folder on her computer labeled baby names, something Ethan would never think to look at, and filled it with evidence that would destroy him. She also began writing a detailed account of the abuse. Every insult he'd hurled at her. Every time he withheld money for groceries. Every threat he'd made. She dated each incident and corroborated them with text messages she'd saved, photos she'd taken of bruises she dismissed as accidents, receipts that showed how little money he'd given her for household expenses. Monica called on the 4th day of Naomi's hospitalization, her voice tight with worry. "I heard what happened. The whole church is talking about it. Are you okay? What can I do?" Naomi glanced at the door, making sure no one was in the corridor. "I need your help, but I can't talk about it on the phone. Can you come visit? Tomorrow afternoon?" Monica arrived the next day with flowers and fruit, playing the role of concerned friend perfectly. But once they were alone, Naomi showed her everything she'd found. Monica's eyes widened as she scrolled through the bank statements, the forged documents, the evidence of systematic theft. "Naomi, this is serious criminal activity. You need a lawyer. A good one." "I know. Can you help me find someone? Someone who specializes in domestic violence and fraud cases. Someone who won't be intimidated by Ethan's reputation." "Barrister Chinua Okonkwo," Monica said immediately. "She's fierce, expensive, and she never loses. I'll reach out to her today." "Don't call me. I'll call you," Naomi said. "Ethan might be monitoring my phone. Everything has to be careful from now on." Over the next week, while still recovering in the hospital, Naomi continued building her case. She discovered that Ethan had been systematically draining their joint savings account while restricting her access to money. She found emails between Ethan and Lydia discussing the attack before it happened, messages he'd printed out and forgotten about, stored in a folder in their home office that she remembered seeing months ago. One email made her blood run cold. "Lydia, when are you going to handle her? The baby will be here soon. Ethan, I'm working on it. She won't be a problem much longer. Lydia, promises aren't enough. I need action. Proof that you're serious about us." The emails were dated 2 days before Ethan poured boiling water on her. This was premeditation. This was a conspiracy. This was evidence that would stand up in any court.
Dr.
Helen checked on her that evening and found Naomi sitting up in bed, her laptop open, her expression focused and calm. "You're not just surviving," Helen observed. "You're preparing for war." "No," Naomi said quietly, looking up from the screen. "I'm preparing for justice. There's a difference. War is about destruction. Justice is about the truth." But she wasn't ready to strike yet. She needed one more thing. She needed Ethan and Lydia to believe they'd won. To think she was broken and compliant. Because people who thought they'd won got careless. They made mistakes. They left trails. When Naomi was finally released from the hospital 10 days after the attack, she did something that shocked everyone who knew what had happened. She went home with Ethan. Dr. Helen protested. Inspector Holloway recommended a women's shelter. Monica begged her to stay at her apartment. But Naomi insisted, signing waivers, claiming she believed Ethan's accident story, saying she wanted to keep her family together for the baby's sake. What she didn't tell anyone was that this was strategy. She needed access to the house, to Ethan's home office, to physical documents she couldn't obtain remotely. She needed to search filing cabinets and desk drawers and forgotten boxes in the storage room. So she returned home and became the perfect picture of a submissive, traumatized wife. When Ethan criticized her cooking, she apologized. When he complained about the house, she agreed and cleaned harder. When he mentioned Lydia, she said nothing, just nodded and smiled. Ethan, Relieved that she wasn't fighting, that the police investigation seemed to be stalling, let his guard down completely. He started bringing Lydia to the house again when Naomi was resting, having meetings in his office, laughing about their future, celebrating their apparent victory. And while they celebrated in the office downstairs, Naomi was in the bedroom upstairs, photographing every document in Ethan's filing cabinet with her phone. Business contracts showing unreported income. Bank statements from accounts she'd never known existed. Tax records that didn't match what he'd filed officially. Emails discussing real estate deals where he'd defrauded investors. The evidence of fraud went far beyond just the stolen land. Ethan had been running schemes for years, and he'd kept records of everything because he'd never imagined his submissive wife would know how to read them. Every night, after Ethan fell asleep, Naomi uploaded everything to a secure cloud account. She sent encrypted copies to Dr. Helen with instructions on what to do if anything happened to her. She built a case that would stand up in criminal court, not just family court. 3 weeks before her due date, Naomi met barrister Chinua Okonkwo in secret at a cafe across town. She told Ethan she had a doctor's appointment and took a taxi, paying cash so there would be no electronic trail. She laid out everything: the documents, the recordings of Lydia's threats, the medical records, the forged signatures, the stolen property, the systematic financial abuse. Barrister Okonkwo's eyes widened as she reviewed the evidence. Mrs. Carter, this is one of the most comprehensive cases I've ever seen. With this evidence, we can get you everything. Full custody, asset recovery, restitution. We can also pursue criminal charges against both your husband and his mistress. I want all of it, Naomi said quietly. And I want to file the day after I give birth. I want them to think they're safe. I want them to celebrate. And then I want to take everything. Barrister Okonkwo smiled. Then let's prepare for battle. The hardest role Naomi ever played was the confident auditor in Lagos boardrooms, or the hopeful bride at her wedding. It was the broken wife pretending to accept her fate while secretly dismantling her husband's entire world. Every morning, she woke before Ethan and prepared his breakfast exactly how he liked it. She ironed his shirts with careful precision, making sure the collars were crisp, the creases sharp. She smiled when he criticized her, apologized when he complained, and never, ever mentioned the burns that were still healing under her long sleeves. When Ethan stayed out until midnight with Lydia, Naomi said nothing. When he came home smelling of another woman's perfume, she simply asked if he wanted tea. When he brought Lydia to the house for business meetings, Naomi retreated to the bedroom without protest, playing the defeated wife who knew her place. Ethan relaxed into this new dynamic like a man sinking into a comfortable chair. The police investigation had gone quiet after he'd hired an expensive lawyer who claimed the evidence was circumstantial. Dr. Helen's medical report sat in a file somewhere, but without Naomi pushing the case forward, it seemed to be fading. Ethan began to believe he'd gotten away with it, that his wife had learned her lesson, that the natural order had been restored. He had no idea that the woman making his breakfast was photographing his tax documents, that the wife who smiled apologetically when he criticized her was recording every insult on her phone, that the submissive housewife was systematically gathering evidence that would destroy him. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after returning home, Naomi was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard Lydia's voice in Ethan's office. The door was partially open, and their conversation carried clearly down the hallway. "She's finally learned to behave," Lydia said with satisfaction. "Took long enough. I knew the hospital incident would break her spirit." "Hospital incident?" Ethan laughed. "You mean when she accidentally knocked over the kettle?"
Right.
Accidentally. The sarcasm in Lydia's voice was thick. "Anyway, now that she's manageable, when are you filing for divorce?" "I'm tired of waiting, Ethan. I want the life you promised me. After the baby comes. It'll look better if I wait until after she gives birth. More sympathetic. Then I'll file. Claim she's an unfit mother, unstable, unable to care for herself, let alone a child. I'll get custody, she'll get nothing, and we can finally be together properly." Naomi stood frozen at the kitchen counter, her hand resting on her 8-month belly, listening to them plan her complete destruction. But instead of breaking down, instead of crying or confronting them, she pulled out her phone and pressed record. Every word, every laugh, every casual mention of their conspiracy, all captured in clear audio. When they finally left the office and found Naomi setting the table for lunch, she smiled pleasantly.
Food is ready.
Would Lydia like to stay? Lydia looked at her with barely concealed contempt. No, thank you. I have standards for where I eat. Naomi just nodded, her face showing nothing while her phone in her pocket held everything. That evening, she sent the recording to Barrister Okonkwo with a simple message. More evidence. They think they've won. But maintaining the facade was exhausting. Every day, Naomi had to suppress her rage, swallow her pride, pretend to be someone she wasn't. Some nights, after Ethan fell asleep, she'd lock herself in the bathroom and cry silently, her hand over her mouth to muffle the sounds. She'd look at herself in the mirror, at the healing scars on her arms, at her pregnant belly, at the exhausted woman staring back, and remind herself why she was doing this. For her daughter. For justice. For every woman who'd ever been told she was nothing. Monica provided crucial support during those weeks. She'd text Naomi at random times with coded messages. How's the baby registry coming along? Which really meant, are you okay? Do you need an escape plan? Naomi would respond with seemingly innocent updates about nursery furniture that actually contained information about evidence she'd gathered. One afternoon, Monica came to visit under the pretense of bringing baby clothes. Ethan was out, and the two women sat in the nursery Naomi had been preparing, surrounded by boxes of tiny clothes and blankets. How much longer can you do this? Monica asked quietly. I can see what it's costing you. You look exhausted. 2 more weeks until my due date, Naomi said. Then 1 week after the baby comes, just enough time to recover slightly and for Ethan to think everything is settled. Then we file. And you're sure about going back to court? You could just take the settlement Barrister Okonkwo negotiated. It's generous. You'd be financially secure. It's not about the money. Naomi folded a tiny onesie, her movements careful and deliberate. It's about the truth. About making sure what he did is on record. About protecting my daughter and every other woman he might hurt in the future. She looked up at Monica, and her eyes were hard with determination. He poured boiling water on me while I was pregnant, Monica. He stole my inheritance. He conspired with his mistress to destroy me. And he thinks he's going to get away with it. I can't let that happen. I won't. The psychological toll of the performance showed in small ways. Naomi stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. She developed a nervous habit of checking over her shoulder constantly. Her hands shook when Ethan entered a room unexpectedly. But she never broke character. Never let him see that she was anything other than the defeated wife he expected. One evening, Ethan came home in an unusually good mood. He'd closed a major property deal, and he was actually smiling when he walked through the door. Naomi, he called out. Come here. I have news. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Yes. I just made 12 million Nigerian nairas on the Riverside property. Biggest deal of my career. He was practically glowing with pride. We should celebrate. Let me take you to dinner. For a moment, Naomi almost broke. Almost screamed at him that we hadn't made anything, that he'd stolen her property to fund his business, that his success was built on her destruction. But she caught herself. That's wonderful, Ethan. Congratulations. But I'm so tired, and my feet are swollen. Could we celebrate at home instead? I'll make your favorite meal. His smile dimmed slightly. He'd probably been hoping to take Lydia to dinner under the guise of celebrating with his wife. But he nodded.
Fine.
Make that pepper soup I like. That night, while Ethan ate and talked about his success, Naomi mentally added, admission of 12 million Nigerian nairas property deal to her list of undisclosed income. She'd already found records suggesting that deal wasn't properly reported to tax authorities. The evidence kept mounting. Every day brought new discoveries. Ethan was careless in his confidence, leaving documents scattered around his office, having conversations with Lydia that Naomi could overhear and record. He'd become so certain of his control over her that he'd stopped being careful. 2 days before Naomi's due date, Lydia made another mistake. She showed up at the house unannounced while Ethan was out, claiming she needed to pick up some business files. Naomi let her in, playing the meek housewife. But as Lydia walked through the house with proprietary confidence, touching furniture and making comments about how she'd redecorate once she moved in, Naomi's phone was recording every word. "You know this will be my house soon," Lydia said, running her hand along the dining room table. "Ethan and I have already discussed it. You'll take whatever small settlement he offers and find somewhere else to live. Maybe your mother's place? Though I hear it's quite cramped." "Whatever Ethan thinks is best," Naomi said softly. Lydia smiled. "You know, I almost feel sorry for you. You really thought he loved you, didn't you? That he'd chosen you for something other than convenience. But men like Ethan don't marry for love. They marry for image. And once you've served your purpose, giving him a child, playing the respectable wife, you're disposable." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Between you and me, the night he burned you, he called me right after. He was shaking, terrified about what he'd done. And do you know what I told him? I told him he should have finished the job." Naomi's hand tightened on her phone, but her face remained neutral. "Is that everything you came to say?" Lydia laughed. "Just wanted to make sure you understood your position. Ethan belongs to me. This house will belong to me. And that baby you're carrying? Well, children need mothers who can actually take care of them, don't they? Not burned, traumatized women who can barely function." After Lydia left, Naomi sat down at the kitchen table and listened to the recording 3 times. He should have finished the job. That single sentence was worth more than any document she'd found. It was confession, admission, proof of conspiracy to commit murder. She sent it immediately to Barrister Okonkwo and Inspector Holloway. That night, Naomi went into labor. The contractions started around midnight, gentle at first, but building in intensity. Ethan drove her to the hospital, playing the concerned husband role for the benefit of the nurses and doctors. 16 hours later, Naomi gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She named her Grace. Grace that had sustained her through the darkest months, grace that had given her strength when she had none, grace that promised redemption and new beginnings. As she held her daughter for the first time, looking down at that tiny, perfect face, Naomi felt the last piece of her plan click into place. This was what she'd been fighting for. This was why she'd endured the performance, the abuse, the careful gathering of evidence. Ethan came to see them once, briefly, looking uncomfortable around the newborn. He stayed less than 10 minutes before claiming he had business to attend to. Naomi knew he was meeting Lydia, celebrating the birth, but really celebrating that soon he'd be free. Let them celebrate, Naomi thought, holding Grace close. Let them think they've won. 1 week later, exactly as planned, a process server knocked on Ethan's door while he was at home. Naomi and Grace were still at her mother's house, recovering from the birth under the watchful care of Mrs. Reeves, who'd finally been told the full truth. The divorce papers Ethan received that morning weren't the simple, quiet dissolution he'd been planning. They were a 47-page legal filing accompanied by criminal complaints, evidence of fraud, documentation of abuse, and a motion for emergency custody and asset freezing. And attached to the papers was an invitation to a community meeting at their church that evening, where Naomi requested his presence to discuss the future of their family. Ethan had no idea what was coming, but Naomi knew. She'd planned every detail. The performance was over. Now came justice.